Hand embroidery stitches can be started with or without a knot. I will show you 5 different ways to start your embroidery stitches, along with hints on which method will work best for what kind of embroideries. If you are a beginner, I suggest that you start your stitching with a knot. As you ease up on your stitching skills, feel free to try the knot-free methods. Begin by tying a knot at the longer end of your thread. There are a few ways in which you can make the knots. I have shown them in a separate video if you want to check them out. I'm using the overhand method to make the knots here. Though traditionally knots at the back of the fabric are not appreciated, I must admit that most of us use it without guilt. There is no problem in having a back with knots that reveal the start and end of your stitches. Knots are acceptable if the back of your fabric is hidden or does not matter. You can now start stitching. Come out from your fabric from the back. The knot secures the stitch on the fabric. Oh, let me show you the back side as well. This is how the knot shows on the back side. As I said, though it is okay to begin a stitch with knots, some embroideries require you to avoid them for technical reasons, like when working on needlepoint. The holes in the even weave fabric, like the Aida fabric, won't hold the knots, and we have to use another method to secure the thread. Once the stitching is finished, you can cut out the excess part of the tail. You can begin any kind of stitch, straight line stitches, filling stitches, or even isolated stitches with a knot. Now I will show you a few knot-free methods. Using the waist knot method is an option if you have enough thread to spare. You would begin by making a knot on the longer end of your thread. Then, start away from the area of stitching from the top of the fabric. Keep the distance around 10 centimeters far. You would then come out from the actual place of stitching and start to stitch. After the stitching is done, come back to where you had anchored the knot on the fabric and snip it off. Then, turn over your embroidery hoop to see the open tail. Thread it back into the needle and weave the thread into the nearby stitches a few times. It's best to use the whipping method. Snip off the excess thread. This method works great for surface and counted embroidery methods like cross-stitching and needlepoint. In the tuck tail method, you will leave the thread ends open, which means you will not knot it. Bring the needle out from behind the fabric and turn over your hoop. Do not pull the thread all the way out. Leave the thread around 4 centimeters long. Then continue to stitch. Pass down your needle and come back up. I'm making the stem stitch. This works for almost all the stitches. When you come back up, do not pull the thread all the way. Turn your hoop around and see the last bit of thread making the loop. Pause, insert the tail into this loop, and then pull out the thread entirely. This loop catches the thread and pins it down on the fabric well. Do that a few times to secure more, though this is just an option. I will do it 2 more times. And that's the 3rd time I'm going to do this. It's a real neat way to secure the end of the thread. Snip off the excess tail on the back of the fabric and finish your stitching. This method can be used mainly for stitches that fall in a line. It can be used for filling stitches and many isolated stitches as well. It's an excellent method to use on counted thread embroidery like cross stitch. The next method is to start with a loop. Note that you will be doubling your thread, so you always end up with an even number of strands for your stitching. I will use 2 strands of thread to get 4 strands after doubling it. Bring the ends of the thread together so the other end forms a loop. Feed the needle with all the 4 strands of the thread. Keep the looped end as the long side. Now bring out your needle from behind the fabric. Do not pull it out completely. Leave a bit of the loop. Now pass your needle through the fabric in your stitch direction. Turn your hoop around. Pass your needle through the loop and pull it out. Your thread is now secure. You can now continue stitching. This is an excellent method for counted thread embroidery like cross-stitching or needlepoint. It is great for surface embroidery if you are okay with working with an even number of strands. Be careful to half the number of strands that you wish to stitch with, as you will be doubling it. The last method I want to show is the anchor stitch method. You would make a small knot at the end of the thread. Start from the top of the fabric, a little ahead of the start point on the stitch line. Make a few running stitches or half back stitches in the reverse direction towards the starting point. These stitches form the anchors. Now make your regular stitches. I'm working the stem stitch. When you approach the knot, just snip it off and continue. The actual stitches will sit on these anchor stitches, hiding it completely. When done, turn the hoop around and snip off any excess thread. Personally, this is my favorite method. So that is how all the 5 stitches look on the back side. When you start with a knot, when you start with a wasted knot, when you start with a tuck tail, sort of a zigzag, when you start with a loop and when you start with anchor stitches. Now, I also want to show you how to deal with anchor stitches when working on filling and isolated stitches. You would follow the same technique. When working on isolated stitches like the French knots or the colonial knots, make tiny anchor stitches on the spots where you will be working them. You need to do this only a couple of times, or 3 or 4 times at the most. Then you would work the French knots right on top of these anchor stitches. This hides the anchor stitches. Snip off the knot. This is how the backside would look like. When working on filling stitches, make a few tiny stitches randomly in the area to be filled. Snip off the knot. Start working on your filling stitch in the area. I'm doing the satin stitch. The anchor stitches get covered completely. This is how the backside would look like. Now, let me show you how to end a stitch with a neat little knot. Make sure that you come out from the back side of your project. Now, pass the needle under the nearest stitch and take the needle through the loop to pull and create a tiny knot. This should be enough to secure your stitch, but if you can create one more knot in a similar fashion, it can secure it further. That's it. If you're thinking how this method will work with stitches that does not go in a straight line, here is an example with the French knots. Turn around your hoop and work a couple of knots the exact same way using the nearest stitches that you can find. Now, if you want to end a stitch without a knot, come out from behind the embroidery hoop. Turn your hoop around and start whipping the thread around a few of the nearest stitches. And that's it. This is easy to do, especially if you're working on a linear stitch. So let me show you how to end without a knot when working on other kinds of backsides. This is the backside of the satin stitch. Weave your needle up and down the stitches a few times. You can also work a reverse journey to secure it better. And I will do it just one more time. That is it. I hope you liked learning the many ways to start and end the stitches from this video. Please let me know if you have. Enjoy your embroidery projects, and thank you so much for watching.